Before diving into property torts, let us quickly recall the intentional torts against persons we previously examined. These foundational torts included battery, requiring harmful or offensive contact, assault, the apprehension of such contact, false imprisonment, the unlawful restraint of movement, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, involving extreme and outrageous conduct causing severe distress. Now, we shift our focus entirely to torts protecting property interests. This video will thoroughly explain trespass to land and conversion, both of which are crucial and frequently tested on the multi-state bar examination. Understanding this distinction is vital for exam success. We are moving from protecting personal integrity and bodily autonomy to protecting ownership rights over tangible assets. This transition sets the stage for analyzing precisely how the law protects real property versus personal property from intentional interference. We now transition directly into the elements defining trespass to land. This tort protects an individual's interest in the exclusive possession of their real property. Trespass to land is legally defined as an intentional physical invasion of the plaintiff's real property. Let us break down the intent requirement, as this is often misunderstood. The actor must possess the requisite intent, meaning they must intend to enter the land itself, or intend to cause some object or person to enter the land. Crucially, the actor does not need to intend to cause any actual harm to the property, nor do they need to know or believe that their entry is forbidden or wrongful. If you intended to step onto the area you believed was public sidewalk, but it turned out to be private lawn, the intent element for trespass is satisfied because you intended the physical act of entry onto that space. Therefore, the core protected interest here is not necessarily the physical condition of the land, but rather the owner's right to exclusive possession and control over that space. Now that we understand the intent required, let us focus specifically on the second critical component, the entry. What exactly constitutes an entry sufficient to trigger liability for trespass? The most straightforward scenario involves the actor's own physical body crossing the boundary line of the plaintiff's property. However, the invasion does not require direct physical contact by the actor. Entry is also satisfied if the actor causes any object or substance to cross the boundary. This includes tangible items, but also intangible substances like water, smoke, or even debris entering the airspace or subsurface. Furthermore, entry can occur through remaining on the land after permission to be there has been expressly or implicitly revoked. This is often termed re-entry. Finally, remember that property rights extend vertically. Entry can occur above the surface, such as flying a drone too low, or below the surface, provided these intrusions fall within the reasonable limits of the property rights associated with the land. Having established what constitutes an unauthorized entry, we must now address the consequence of that entry. A critical feature of trespass to land is that it is actionable per se. This means the tort is complete upon the unauthorized physical invasion itself. Liability attaches regardless of whether the plaintiff suffered any actual, measurable harm or damage to the land. If only the entry is proven, the plaintiff is entitled to recover at least nominal damages, perhaps $1, simply to vindicate their right to exclusive possession. This strict liability standard contrasts sharply with many other torts, such as negligence, where proof of actual injury is a prerequisite for recovery. Because the harm is often intangible, the violation of the right itself, injunctive relief is frequently sought by landowners. An injunction orders the trespasser to cease future unauthorized entries, providing a proactive remedy against repeated invasions. We have seen that trespass to land is strictly enforced. However, even strict liability torts recognize certain justifications for the invasion, known as defenses. The most significant defense applicable here is necessity. Necessity operates to excuse an intentional intrusion when the actor reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent a significant harm. This defense splits into two categories. First, public necessity. This applies when the interference is justified to protect a significant public interest or a large group of people, such as entering private land to escape a raging wildfire or to prevent the spread of disease. When public necessity applies, the entry is entirely privileged, and the actor owes no compensation to the landowner. Second, we have private necessity. This occurs when the actor enters the land to protect their own interest, or the interest of a third party, such as docking a boat on private property to avoid sinking in a storm. Crucially, while the entry itself is excused under private necessity, it is not entirely privileged. The actor must still compensate the landowner for any actual damages caused by the protective action. Having thoroughly examined trespass to land and its defenses, we now pivot our focus from real property interests to torts involving personal property, commonly referred to as chattels. Interference with chattels also gives rise to intentional torts, but they exist on a spectrum based on the severity of the interference. On the less severe end, we find trespass to chattels, which addresses minor interferences. As the interference becomes more substantial, we move along this spectrum toward the most serious property tort, conversion. Conversion is the tort reserved for those acts that constitute a complete deprivation of the owner's rights over their property. Historically, this tort was known by the name trover. Understanding where an act falls on this spectrum, whether it is a mere trespass or a full conversion, is critical for determining the appropriate remedy, which we will explore in detail next. We now move to the core definition of conversion, the most serious interference with a chattel. Conversion is defined as the intentional exercise of dominion or control over a chattel which so seriously interferes with the right of another to control it that the actor may justly be required to pay the other the full value of the chattel. Notice the key phrase, so seriously interferes. This is what separates conversion from the lesser offense of trespass to chattels. The interference must be substantial enough to warrant forcing the defendant to essentially purchase the item from the plaintiff. Regarding intent, the rule remains consistent with other intentional torts. The actor must only intend the physical act that results in the control or dominion over the specific item. Crucially, the actor does not need to know who the true owner is, nor do they need to intend to permanently deprive the owner of the property. The intent required is simply the intent to perform the act of control itself. Since determining whether an interference is serious enough for conversion versus merely a trespass to chattels requires judgment, courts rely on several factors, often guided by the restatement of torts. These factors help quantify the severity of the interference. First, consider the extent and duration of the control exercised by the actor over the chattel. A brief touching is less likely to be conversion than holding the item for several days. Second, look at the actor's intent to assert a right inconsistent with the possessor's right. Did the actor claim ownership, or merely borrow it briefly without permission? Asserting ownership rights weighs heavily toward conversion. Third, and critically, examine the extent and duration of the resulting interference with the possessor's use and enjoyment. If the owner is completely locked out of using their property for a significant period, conversion is more likely. These factors, taken together, guide the court in deciding if the interference warrants forcing the defendant to pay the full value, or if lesser damages for trespass to chattels suffice. Now that we have established the factors determining whether an interference rises to the level of conversion, we must examine the critical difference, the remedy. The remedy for conversion is unique and severe. When a court finds conversion, the defendant is effectively forced to purchase the chattel from the plaintiff. This means the defendant must pay the plaintiff the full fair market value of the item at the time and place the conversion occurred. This is often termed a forced sale. This stands in sharp contrast to the remedy for the lesser tort, trespass to chattels. If the interference only amounts to trespass to chattels, damages are significantly limited. The plaintiff recovers only for the actual harm done, which typically means the diminution in the chattel's value, the cost of necessary repairs, or the reasonable rental value lost during the period of interference. The key takeaway here is the magnitude of the remedy. Full value payment for conversion versus limited actual damages for trespass to chattels. To succeed on the multi-state bar examination, you must master the spectrum of property torts based on the severity of the interference. Let us synthesize these key distinctions now. Trespass to land requires only an intentional, unauthorized physical invasion of real property, and critically, it is actionable per se, meaning no actual harm is necessary for liability. Moving to personal property, trespass to chattels involves a minor interference, resulting only in limited damages, such as the cost of repair or rental loss. Conversion, the most severe interference, involves a major deprivation of the owner's rights, triggering the drastic remedy of a forced sale where the defendant pays the full fair market value. When approaching an examination hypothetical, always ask, is the interference with real property or personal property? If personal property, what is the degree of interference? A slight interference points to trespass to chattels, a substantial, total dominion points directly to conversion. Remember these core differences: invasion versus interference, and per se liability versus damage-based recovery.